Is Rick Warren okay? Ever since he went through the most heartbreaking tragedy of his life on April 5th, 2013, he hasn't been the same. This is the story of how one family's nightmare became a mission, and how even the strongest faith can't protect you from grief that never really goes away. Before his never-ending grief broke him, the world had already seen him break on national television. Back in 2006, when Saddleback was growing really big, Rick's name became very controversial. His growth made him famous, but it also made him a target. Rick created the purpose-driven growth plan, which many churches didn't agree with. Churches across America split because they tried to follow his strategies. Churches dividing, members being pushed out, and friendships ending in arguments over worship styles. Rick hated that. He begged pastors not to force anything, not to kick people out. But the damage happened anyway. And every time a church tore itself apart using his playbook, Rick felt responsible. Then it got worse. In 2008, Rick stepped into a storm he never saw coming. After winning his election, Barack Obama asked him to deliver the inaugural prayer. It should have been an honor. Instead, it became a national scandal. People dug up a letter he'd written to his own church. His personal belief that marriage biblically was between one man and one woman. Rick Warren went from best-selling pastor to a man accused of hate speech. Headlines, protests, calls for his removal. The irony was that 6 months earlier, he'd been working with gay men and women in his church's AIDS ministry, telling reporters he had real friendships in the LGBTQ community. But none of that mattered. America wanted a villain. Obama defended him, said disagreement wasn't hatred. But the backlash burned anyway. While one side demanded he apologize, the other side, many fellow evangelicals, began attacking him for the opposite reason. They said he wasn't harsh enough, not angry enough. Rick looked at them and wondered how fighting people could possibly bring them closer to Jesus. It didn't end there. In 2009 and again in 2012, evangelical pastors criticized Rick for sitting down with Muslims, sharing meals with imams, and attending interfaith conferences about peace and poverty. But that simple idea of friendship set off another wave of outrage. Every time Rick tried to build a bridge, someone accused him of burning one. However, he was used to controversy, used to criticism, but nothing prepared him for the pain that came next. Matthew Warren was 7 when the diagnosis came. Clinical depression, the doctors said, and Rick and Kay Warren couldn't quite wrap their mind around it. How does a child barely old enough to tie his own shoes carry that kind of darkness? But they saw it. The signs were there from the beginning. Something wasn't right. Something in the wiring of his beautiful, brilliant mind that made the world feel sharper, crueler, heavier than it should. He was the kind of kid who could walk into a room and immediately find the person who was suffering. Friends remember Matthew making a beeline toward whoever looked uncomfortable at parties, whoever seemed lost in a crowd. He had this gift, this radar for human hurt. The irony cuts deep. The boy who could sense everyone else's darkness was drowning in his own. Behind closed doors, the Warren family was living a different reality. Doctor appointments that never ended. Medications that promised relief but delivered nothing. Therapy sessions that felt like throwing stones into an ocean. Year after year, watching their son struggle with deep depressions that swallowed him whole. Panic attacks that came out of nowhere. Mood swings that turned his personality inside out. They tried everything. America's best doctors. The most advanced treatments, counselors, prayers from thousands of people around the world. The Warrens kept his illness quiet, not out of shame, but because it was his story to tell, his dignity to protect. When Matthew was 17 years old, sitting across from Rick, the boy looked at him and said something that would haunt the pastor for the rest of his life. He told his dad it was obvious, painfully obvious, that he wasn't going to be healed. They'd been to the best doctors in the nation. He'd taken the best medicine. They tried everything anyone could think of, and nothing worked. So Matthew asked his father the question that no parent should ever have to hear. Why can't I just die and go to heaven? Rick told him he couldn't give up. That as a father, he had to believe there might be an answer out there somewhere. Matthew made it another 10 years after that conversation. 10 years of trying, of hoping, of waking up every morning with that same relentless pain wrapped around his brain like barbed wire. But Rick Warren knew in his guts something bad was coming. He knew that someday, maybe soon, Matthew's pain would become too much to bear. On April 5th, the Warrens had a fun evening together. That's what makes it so devastating. They spent time as a family, laughing, talking, and being together. Everything seemed fine. Matthew seemed fine. But depression is a liar. It tells you there's no way out, no relief, no hope. And in what Rick would later call a momentary wave of despair, Matthew went home to his place in Mission Viejo. Sometime around 10 a.m. that Friday morning, he made a decision that would shatter his family into pieces. He shot himself. The call came in the afternoon. Matthew had been found dead in his home from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The gun had its serial number scratched off, an unregistered weapon he'd bought illegally over the internet. Later, Rick would tweet about the person who sold his son that gun, would say he forgave them. But on that Friday, there was no forgiveness, no theology, no purpose. Just a father who had to identify his son's body. Within 30 minutes of getting the news, Rick and Kay's small group arrived. They just showed up, wrapped their arms around the Warrens, and stood there. The deeper the pain, Rick would say later, the fewer words you need. That night, his small group slept on couches in the kitchen wherever they could find space. They said, "We're not leaving you alone." And they didn't. The next day, Rick wrote to his congregation at Saddleback Church. After he empathized because now he knew what it felt like to bury your child. Rick talked about grief as God's gift, the way we transition through loss. He cried on stage. Kay stood beside him and wiped tears from his cheek. She told the congregation that Matthew's body was broken, that the gun had broken it, but that he'd be raised in glory. She said it's okay to walk through life with tears in your eyes and a smile on your face at the same time. That sermon launched something bigger, a mental health initiative at Saddleback Church. Rick partnered with the National Alliance on Mental Illness, with psychiatrists and counselors, and anyone who would listen. He started asking, why do we feel shame when our brains break down? He talked about Matthew openly now, called him brave. Said Matthew was one of the bravest people he'd ever met, because he kept going for 10 more years. Rick wrote in his journal that in God's garden of grace, even broken trees bear fruit. It became his way of making sense of the senseless. And Rick forgave not just the gun seller, but life itself. He never questioned his faith in God. He questioned God's plan. There's a difference. He knew God was good, but not everything that happens is God's will. God allows things because we live in a world of free choices. Rick never really moved past it. How could he? You don't move past losing a child. You get through it. Maybe you learn to carry it, but it's always there. Rick told people he cried every single day after Matthew died. Every single day. And he didn't see that as weakness. He saw it as love. Mental health advocacy became his mission. In 2025, Rick was still at it, still preaching, still traveling the world. He and Kay lived on 9% of their income and gave away 91%. They have 5 grandchildren now. Life continued, but in the quiet moments, Rick Warren was still that father who couldn't save his son, still carrying that conversation from when Matthew was 17. The pain hadn't gone away. It had just become part of who he was. Rick Warren is still grieving. Years later, more than a decade later, the loss hasn't diminished. Time doesn't heal all wounds. Some wounds just become scars you learn to live with. He preaches about hope, but carries despair. He talks about God's goodness while questioning God's plan. He helps millions find their purpose while wondering if he could have done more to save Matthew. Rick Warren's faith didn't break. That's what he tells people. He never questioned God's existence, never doubted heaven. Matthew's body was broken, but he's in glory now. Rick knows it in his bones. He'll see his son again someday. But the question lingers, is Rick Warren really okay? He says he's different now, changed, more empathetic. The polished megachurch pastor who wrote best-selling books has been replaced by something raw, more human. Every Monday morning, he wakes up wondering if someone else could do a better job, wondering if he's smart enough, strong enough, faithful enough to lead a church of tens of thousands. The doubt creeps in, the exhaustion, the weight of carrying everyone else's burdens while barely managing his own. He tells people that God never allows more on you than he puts in you to bear it. But what happens when your burden becomes too heavy to carry? What happens when faith in medicine and prayer still isn't enough? Rick doesn't have those answers. Nobody does. All he has is the choice to keep going or to stop, and he chooses to keep going. But the cracks show. Kay stands beside him, wiping his tears, carrying her own broken heart. They're not the same people they were before April 5th, 2013. The story doesn't have a neat ending. Just a man who lost his son, who questions God's plan while clinging to God's goodness, who preaches hope while living with heartbreak. Just a father who forgave the person who sold his son a gun. Because forgiveness is what you're supposed to do, even when it feels impossible. Is Rick Warren